Hi guys, good morning. So we are at the fourth discussion in our computer programming 11B. So in this lesson, we'll be learning about creating instance methods in a class. So here are the following objectives. So last meeting, we were able to discuss the classes and objects, and we will also be able to create a very simple class. And for today, we will be learning about the following. So, creating instance methods in a class, we have two different concepts that you have to remember. First of all is what we call the mutator methods. When I say mutator methods, I am referring to what we call the set methods. So, set methods are usually, it's being used to change field values. Set. Okay? Now, accessor methods are methods that retrieve. Now, accessor methods usually have or starts with a prefix get. So when I say set methods, I'm referring to mutator methods, and get methods, I'm referring to accessor methods. So again, this is actually not required, the set get, but then it's conventional. So let's take a look at this example here. Now, this is an example of a methods that uses the mutators and accessors. So, based on what you are seeing here in mutator method, we have a return type which is void. Meanwhile, here on the get method, we have a return type which is an integer. So, meaning from the keyword set, you are setting a value here. Meanwhile, you are getting that value from here. Okay, so non-static methods, I have mentioned this from the previous lesson. Those are the methods used with object instantiations. That's why it's called instance methods. So you can actually use either static or non-static. And method with an object, but only non-static methods behave uniquely for each object. So later on we can actually see what's the difference between them. Okay, so you cannot use a non-static method without an object. So let's now proceed with the word static, because I am always mentioning the word static. Even from the last lesson, I have explained what static means. Now in Java, it's a keyword, but it can be used as an adjective. Now, static fields, say for example, public static void. So those are, or public static class. Now, those are called class fields. Now, when there are some static keywords in a particular methods, those are what we call class methods. Say for example here, when you use a static field or a method, you do not need to use an object. For example here, JOption pane that show dialog. So you don't have to use the word static, because automatic, this method here is an object. So when you create a class with a static field and instantiate 100 objects, for example, only one copy of that field exists in a memory. Meanwhile, when you create a static method in a class and instantiated 100 objects, only one copy of the method exists in the memory, and the method doesn't receive a this reference, which will be discussed further in the next lessons. A this reference. So static classes variables are not instance variables. I want you guys to remember that. It's not instance variables. So meanwhile, the system allocates memory to whole class variables once per class. So no matter how many instances of the class you instantiate, the system allocates memory for class variables the first time it encounters a class, and every instance of a class shares the same copy of any static class variables. So let's proceed with non-static. Non-static, there is no particular keyword comparing to the word static. So if you would like to declare a class or a method as a static, you have to place a static keyword. For non-static, no need for you to add any keyword on that one. So it's automatic. So non-static, all or everything you have declared, it's by default a non-static fields. So non-static fields are called instance variables. So non-static methods in a class are called instance methods. So where can we see non-static field or method? Here. System.out a print line. So when you create a class with a non-static field and instantiate 100 objects, then on 100 copies of that field exist in memory. And when you create a non-static method in a class and instantiate 100 objects, only one copy of the method exists in the memory, but the method receives this reference that contain the address of the object currently using it. So, instance fields and methods are non-static. Now let's take a look at this test class example. And let's try to read and analyze each part of the code. So we have a class here. So we have instantiated an object. Okay, we instantiated an object with a name, my class. There you go. Now inside the my class object, we have the following method: the public static, private static, public, and so on. Now here on object.pub_nonstat method, this actually means you are calling this object. Okay, you are calling this object and this method from this class. Okay, and take note, where can we see this pub_nonstat method? Here. And take note, it's a public, meaning we can access and call this method even though it's saved in another class. Next, the object.pubstat method. Pubstat method here. So the public static method can be used from test class with or without an object. As you can see here, we can also access this method, myClass.pubstat method. Now take a look. We actually called a pubstat method, but then we use this myClass name. What does it mean? Again, it can be used from test class with an object, with or without an object. So therefore, class, if you are trying to analyze this part of the code, you can actually, since it's a non-static here, okay, it's a non-static class, by the way. No need for you to add you do not need to add another keyword for non-static variables or for non-static classes. Okay, so here on this part, private stat method. Now let's take a look at this. The test class doesn't have access to the private method. Why? Why does it have any access to the private method? Here, private stat method. It's actually because we have declared this method here, as a private static method. Meaning, this method here can only be accessed by this class. And it's private and static. Next, the non-static method must be used with a myClass object. Here. And an object can use a static or non-static method, but these methods are private and cannot be used here. Both of them. So this part of the code here, this is wrong on 2 counts, and because the method is non-static, so it needs an object. In any event, the method is private. Non-stat method. Private non-stat method. There you go. Now let's take a look at this example here. Public class employee, And inside the public class employee, I have declared four different four different data types with variables. Now let's see here. We have an integer empnum, string, and a double. So most classes that you have created here have multiple data fields and methods. So for example, an employee needs a last name, a first name, and of course a salary to get those particular fields. So here on this part, we should be able to see the following mutators and accessors. So we have the following what do you call this one, data types and variables. So we have also a method get empnum, which will return a value empnum, and we also have a set empnum. We have a mutator, we have an accessor. This simply means any values that we have actually placed once we call this method set empnum, will now be automatically get by this method get empnum. Same goes through with this one. Return emp last name. And this one. So the employee class with several data fields and corresponding methods. So I actually suggest for you guys to do this and copy the entire code. So this is one class here, and try to run this. Try to create another class, that calls this particular class what you're seeing. But then inside that class contains the main method where you will now be throwing some values for empnum, last name, first name, and salary, and see what will happen. Now, declaring objects and using their methods. Declaring a class doesn't create any actual objects. So, also, a class is just an abstract description of an object. Will be like if any objects are actually instantiated. There are two different processes that creates an object in an instance of a class. First, you supply a type and an identifier, just as when you declare any variable. And then you allocate computer memory for that object. So for example, here, declare an integer as an int some value, and you might declare an employee. So that's how you declare objects. Now, let's have some few reminders regarding this one. When you declare an integer as int some value, you notify the compiler that an integer named some value will exist, and you reserve computer memory for it at the same time. So when also declaring some employee instance of the employee class, you're also notifying the compiler that you will use the identifier some employee. However, you are not yet setting aside computer memory in which the employee named some employee might be stored. That is done automatically only for primitive data types. So to allocate the needed memory for an object, you must use a new operator. Two statements that actually set aside enough memory to hold an employee are as follows. There you go. So, as I have said earlier, remember this part of the presentation, this one, the public class. So that's only a single class. Now, I want you guys to create this second class. Okay? Now, this class here, what you are seeing, this is actually the main method is inserted here in this class. And inside the main method is where we instantiated two different objects, meaning two different employee types. One is a clerk and one is a driver. Now, first of all, when we set an employee number for the clerk, this is how to do that. And notice that once you have set an employee number, it actually called this method here. Where is that method? Here, set employee number. So any values that have set from that method will now be thrown here in the emp variable here, and will now be getting by the empnum variable. So automatic, since the value here was get by the empnum, automatic now, let's take a look here. The automatic here on this part, the clerk that get empnum will get the value of 345 that you have set from the class. And take note, since everything is public static, okay, so it's public static. I hope you understood that. That's how it actually works. It's very simple. So the employee here has, the employee method has, or is actually a constructor. Let me introduce that word. This is a what we call constructor, a special type of method that creates and initializes objects. You can write your own constructors for a class. So after this object has been instantiated, its methods can now be accessed using the object's identifier, a dot, and a method call. That's why if you want to use or call this method, we will just be using the object name clerk and the driver clerk name here. And then the declare two employees application, which is this one, can use these methods because they are public, and it must use each of them with an employee object because the methods are non-static. So if I added here a static, it will not run. So do we have any questions for this lesson? Nothing? Alright, thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.